All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the AI4 webinar series. We are so glad to have everyone here today. My name is Patrika Elise. I'll be your MC for today. Before we welcome our panelists, just a quick note, please make sure to put your questions in the Q&A box instead of the chat. This makes it easier for us to organize your questions so that we can get to as many as possible. Thank you. And for today's webinar topic, we're talking about using AI for compliance in financial services. Without further ado, I'd love to welcome our panelists to the virtual stage.
Thank you, Patrika. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, panelists. I'm really excited about this webinar. Without any further ado, we'll do self-introductions. I'm Daniel Lackland. I will be moderating the panel. And if each panelist would be okay with this, we're going to go around and just introduce ourselves. Marina, would you like to kick it off with a self-introduction?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Marina Kaganovich. I head the US CIB Digital Compliance Team at BNP Paribas, where I advise on emerging technology, AI, robotics, and digital transformation initiatives. I've held this role for a little over 5 years now. And prior to joining BNP, I held a similar role at Goldman Sachs. I'm very excited to be here and talking about this very timely and relevant topic. And just want to note by way of a brief disclaimer that I do so in a personal capacity and that the views that I express are my own and don't represent those of BNP.
Thank you so much, Marina. Amit, would you like to give a self-introduction?
Hi, this is Amit Srivastav. I manage the model risk team within audit and Morgan Stanley. Very excited to be here. I've been in this role for 5 years, and before that, I had a similar role at Bank of America. Really excited to take part in this conversation with my esteemed peers, Marina and Pam. And like Marina, I would just put the same disclaimer that whatever I say here is my own personal view, nothing to do with Morgan Stanley.
Thank you, Amit. And last but not least, Pam, would you like to jump in?
Hi, my name is Pamela Kalakian. I'm a Director of Compliance and Controls at Bank of New York Mellon, specific to the asset servicing and digital line of business. I recently went back to the industry. Previous to my role at BNY, I was part of a management consultant team, started there in analytics and now ended up supporting compliance, AML and sanctions. In my role today in BNY, it's quite exciting, right, to be in this space because, as you know and hear about in the news, digital assets, so we need to try to keep up managing all of these regulatory requirements in the space. And similar to what Marina and Amit said, my views are my own and not BNY's. Happy to be here.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. Without any further ado, let's jump into question number 1, Patrika. Okay, the question is, how much adoption of AI have you seen for compliance use cases, and exactly how widespread is this technology right now? And Marina, I would be honored if you would jump in and kick us off with this question.
Sure, great question. So across financial services, and I think within compliance more specifically, various use cases have been identified that I think can benefit from AI adoption. And they really span the gamut from regulatory change management to transaction monitoring to e-communications and voice surveillance. And, I can't speak other than anecdotally as to how widespread the use of such technology is, but I would say that from what I've seen, these use cases are being evaluated by financial institutions with increasing interest and levels of commitment. And really, I think the spur of digital innovation is especially pronounced as financial services continue to grapple with high volumes of data and meeting requirements from various regulatory bodies, I think as Pam noted, and pressure to really operationalize and garner efficiencies in recurring and highly manual and time-consuming reviews. I would note, though, that I think the use of AI seems to be occurring in pockets within organizations, with many firms focusing on testing the waters and becoming acquainted with the service offering, as well as making sure that they're able to train staff on the use of AI-enabled tools and and the limitations, that those tools have. So my inclination is that organizations are also being conservative from a risk tolerance perspective, and that there remains a hesitancy to some extent to implementing AI, really pushing forward only where there's a very high level of accuracy and comfort that has been demonstrated through rigorous testing. But I think that, as that level of comfort increases through increased usage, and I would anticipate that, we'll start to really see AI being implemented more and more, and additional use cases being identified for compliance specifically.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marina. Amit or Pam, would either of you like to weigh in on the state of adoption for AI within compliance right now?
Sure. I mean, I can go first, Amit. I mean, I think to Marina's point, I agree with the input that she provided. We see a lot in fraud, right? When you talk about banking, credit card payments, right? And any area that is very data intensive, right? And you talk about AML from a transaction monitoring standpoint, sanction screening specifically, that's another item where you apply all of these, artificial intelligence rules, trade surveillance, regulatory scanning. You really talked about change management. Marina mentioned that. And I think that's critical because in our position as compliance officers, what we really need to understand is what are the regulatory changes that are happening in the businesses that we support, and how does our operational processes, our business, values, and the way that we conduct business align to those regulatory requirements.
Yeah, I would add, I think my sense is that it's at the nascent stage. The AI adoption within compliance is at the nascent stage. It's not yet mainstream. I think different, techniques are being tried out in some of the areas that Pam and Marina have mentioned, like transaction monitoring, for OFAC compliance and other areas, but they're in sort of the stages of being tried to see how it compares with what is there currently in place. The benefits have not yet been seen to sort of make the conclusion they are vastly superior. But I think it's a matter of time as this becomes, we need time to see that how the results pan out over a number of years, over a number of cycles to see the benefit of it. So it's at a very nascent stage, I would say. But the need is clearly there because, we have vastly more amounts of data. From the latest counts, I think we have a 90% false positive rate. So there's a lot of false positives, a lot of data. We can't just put more people to sort of do the surveillance. So I think there's definitely a need to try smarter techniques, using machine learning and AI in this area.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Patricia, let's jump to question number 2. Okay. The question is, where are you currently seeing AI delivering value in compliance? Please offer as many detailed examples as possible. So again, here, we're just looking for use cases that you find particularly compelling. Pam, I'd be curious if you would be okay with kicking us off here.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the value that I see there, I mentioned, the ones that are heavily data intensive, right? When you talk about transactions, how do you identify, new patterns? Right. I mean, in this world today, when you talk about TM or transaction monitoring in an AML context, it's very rules based, right? It's, what are the red flags that we've identified? Or, if, for example, let's say if the Financial Action Task Force issues, these are the red flags. So what do we develop? Our rules based engines. But it would be good to actually see the use of AI and actually using the techniques of, supervised learning or unsupervised learning. I think that would be, a good use case, and that will deliver a lot of values. Amit also mentioned something around false positives, right? That's another thing where, if you're in the financial services world, you would know about transaction monitoring alerts. And because it's very rules based, right? Some of the things are, that increases the risk or the rate of having the false positive. So then if you apply AI to those, then, do you now get a more targeted result, right? I think what I would want to see too is from a robotic or process automation standpoint is the process of gathering information and due diligence in client onboarding, because there's a lot of analysts. You put in a name, you Google it, negative news, and then you gain or receive the information. How can you automate that process?
Yeah, thank you so much, Pam. That makes a ton of sense. Amit, Marina, would either of you like to jump in here on specific use cases?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Marie.
Oh, thank you. I would echo what Pam said. I think, at least from my experience, what I've seen is that in its present state, AI really delivers value in circumstances where, as Amit had mentioned, there's a large data set, it needs to be analyzed, you need to identify trends, you need to be able to flag the outliers. That certainly has value in various types of reviews. Transaction monitoring, I think, often comes to the forefront of those. And, AI is it's really, I think, adept at doing this type of work and can be a significant value to human reviewers because it can help reduce the noise and really free up time for assessments that are much more likely to pose a real threat and a risk to the organization, and that also require a qualitative and a judgment-based approach that a rule-based AI can help inform, but isn't yet, I think, well developed enough to make sort of without the human element. I think, in addition to some of the use cases that I mentioned in the prior question, the AML, the e-communications, and the voice recording surveillance use cases, I'd also note that there are others for fraud detection, for text analysis, in order to help identify new rules or changes to the existing rules. So the change management, I think that Pam spoke to as well. And really also as part of like the RPA aspect, to identify those changes or those anomalies, and then help direct the information to an impacted person. So for instance, for purposes of rule change management, highlight the change in a particular regulation to a compliance officer, perhaps to a business supervisor, so they can determine the potential impact and also see what changes would need to be made to, internal policies, procedures, controls, et cetera. And I think AI can also be used, to spot other things like customer complaints that would also then be routed, let's say, to an appropriate supervisor or compliance officer. So, I think these are just examples. And while the use cases so far are non-exhaustive, I think that they are telling in terms of, really the breadth and the current prevalence of the use of AI for these cases. And, I think we're really just beginning to see the benefits of AI adoption in this space that's really likely to increase substantially in the next few years.
Amit, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I was going to mention that, I think Pam mentioned that customer segmentation. So using clustering techniques for customer segmentation and risk profiling, that's one area that is, I think a lot of firms are exploring it. And then Pam mentioned supervised learning for, especially in areas of risk scoring. That is another area where, there is some promise, but, I think it's just at the exploration stage I mentioned earlier. Besides AI, I think, if we come down, I think like Marina also mentioned for email scanning, the text analysis, while they don't fall under the umbrella of AI as such, but those are techniques that are becoming more common now.
Excellent. Thank you all. Patricia, let's jump to the next topic. Okay, so you all mentioned some really outstanding use cases. What challenges or difficulties do you see or anticipate when it comes to the adoption of AI-driven technologies? And Amit, I know you just finished speaking there, but I'm curious if you would open us up here about challenges that you face when using these technologies.
I think the challenge is right now proving that this is, a vastly superior technique to what is currently in place. And that alongside the fact that this has to be demonstrated. The proof of evidence has to be there in a concrete form to regulators. I'm speaking for myself. I'm in audit, so we look for that. So both for audit and regulators, we have to prove that this is a better technique. I think there is some sort of leeway around that. The regulators had pushed out a paper in 2018 where they encouraged, basically they told the firms to try using innovative approaches. And they even went so far as to say that if you come up with a technique that is not good, it's still okay. And if you come up with a technique that is superior, doesn't mean that your prior technique was bad. So I think they are sort of encouraging it. That was a very strong statement. But given sort of the heavy penalty on getting it wrong, that adds a lot of weight to make sure that the confidence level has to be very high to make sure this is working before you can replace what is currently being in use.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amit. Marina or Pam, would you like to jump in on challenges?
I can go ahead and go before Marina. So I think there are a couple of challenges from a compliance standpoint. First, it's very manual in nature, right? How can you automate a process that it's very manual? So Marina had talked about, reviewing regulations, having an impact analysis. It will be good to have the component of identifying what changes in the regulations, but the impact analysis of, okay, which one is impacted requires, other components or stakeholders to complete that, right? And if you think about, what are the different roles and responsibilities of compliance? I mean, developing policies and procedures, that's something that you can't, again, automate, right? That's something that a person actually needs to develop. And when you talk about, again, the challenge process, because our role as compliance officers is really to challenge, right? Challenge the business to make sure that whatever they're building or developing is in line with regulations. The other piece is advisory. The thing is, when the business comes to us, it's on a case-by-case basis, right? You need to understand, okay, what's the business model? What's the product that you're trying to develop? And then from there, we need to understand what are the compliance and rules and regulations and requirements that they need to abide by when they're developing all of these new products and services. The second thing that I have is the lack of good data, right? When you talk about AI, there's a need to have good data because that's really what you're trying to assess and analyze, right? Without that, it's going to be difficult to apply AI technology in compliance. The other thing too that I would be thinking of is, you need to start developing relevant KRIs, right? Partnering with your, risk counterparts and understand what will be a good trigger, even with a business, right? What would be a good trigger to identify potential compliance violations? Marina actually talked about customer complaint because that would have been my example too, is that, if I'm seeing a lot of customer complaint, should I use that as a metric so that then I can use that as a trigger that if I'm seeing an increase of that, that may lead to, violations of our compliance requirements. And then the last thing that I would say is talent, right? Compliance is not a sexy role, unfortunately, but then when you start applying analytics to it, then maybe attracting the right talent who wants to be in this space and has the right background to be able to do this, AI techniques that Amit is talking about, then that's something that, that can help us actually build that strong base and be able to apply, AI.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Pam. Amit, Marina, would you like to weigh in here?
Maybe, yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I fully agree with some of the challenges that have been noted by Pam and Amit so far. I think that there's so much excitement about AI implementation that we often forget how difficult it is to actually get it over the finish line. So I think maybe I'll take a slightly different perspective and look at it from an organizational standpoint. So I would say there's a few challenges that come to mind that sort of overarching enterprise level perspective. So the first one is cost and sponsorship. I think a really well executed AI strategy really requires a C-suite level buy-in and budget allocation. And at the outset, achieving that level of buy-in is incredibly difficult, especially in a very cost-constrained environment where there are multiple other competing priorities and groups that are vying for that, for that same budget allocation. And I think that, in order to do that successfully, it's very much dependent on being able to build a consensus for the use cases that you're trying to to address with the use of AI, and to identify the right stakeholders that will partner with you on this project to help get it off the ground. I think, another aspect to consider is assuming that you're able to clear that first hurdle, there is a sort of BAU level aspect to really establishing and making sure that you're able to maintain an effective governance and oversight program that satisfies regulatory requirements and expectations. And that also, includes participation from perhaps those very same stakeholders who helped you launch the program to ensure that there continues to be, an appropriate supervisory structure and visibility to senior management as to the status of the initiative, any issues encountered, client feedback, things like that, things that really help inform not just this particular initiative, but also would be supportive in terms of having those senior management stakeholders able to really discuss the state of AI implementations with regulators. Because if they aren't already, I would very much anticipate that they're going to be asked that question shortly, and they need to be prepared. And I think, what I've heard sort of anecdotally from others is that often senior management, if these programs are sort of done very much like within a particular business unit, for instance, those senior managers that are facing off to regulators may not be as well versed. And when asked the question by a regulator, do you use AI, might actually sort of pause and perhaps say no without really recognizing that it is being used throughout the firm. So I think those two are sort of significant challenges that need to be considered in order to make sure that that things are done well. I'd also say, as Pam mentioned, the internal talent aspect is really critical to long-term success. And this is really irrespective of whether the AI is built in-house or if it's provided by a vendor. It's really critical to make sure that there's internal staff who understand how the AI works. They're able to support the models. They're able to set appropriate thresholds. And they're also able to, to reach out and take user feedback and see what the AI is doing well, where it can be improved, and really aggregate all of this information to inform other potential use cases that might benefit from the implementation. And I think maybe, I know I've been speaking for a while, but the last point I would make is that through all of these initiatives, I think it's really critical to have targeted training and communication to staff. That goes a long way in really addressing any reluctance that they might have in terms of having a successful implementation throughout the firm that they might view as a potential threat to their abilities to do, not to their ability to do their job, but in taking over and having the AI sort of take over a large portion of their job. And I think that this is where transparency is really important, communication around tactical and strategic vision, and also, really partnering with the staff that's doing this role to explain how the AI is meant to enhance their ability to do so rather than potentially take over. I think I'll stop there. I know that was a lot.
Oh, it's great. No, the detail's amazing. I saw you nodding. Do you want to jump in or you just agree?
I was just mentioning that what Marina mentioned about the cost is definitely a big factor, right? Ahead of this panel discussion, I was looking into the numbers. The banks are estimated to spend around 25 billion annually on anti-money laundering efforts. Now that is already with whatever current processes are in place. Now we're speaking about bringing in some new approach, which is going to cost more, given the sort of the war on talent and others. So you have to convince that that despite spending so much money, it's worth spending a lot more to get something done that is. It has not yet been proven. We know it holds promise, but it has not yet been proven. So that getting past the first hurdle that Marina mentioned with respect to C-suite sponsorship and the cost aspect is a big challenge.
Yeah. And Amit, this is, I think, the second time, and I know Marina talked about this. You also mentioned early on that sometimes it's not clear that an AI-driven tool is much better. I am curious if any of you have an anecdote, or maybe you could just say a little bit more about this. When it comes to a potential new use case for an AI-powered compliance tool, is there any particular strategy that you have whereby you evaluate the opportunity and then try to get stakeholder buy-in. How do you actually go about doing that, considering the uncertainty that it sounds like everyone is saying exists?
So I have some thoughts around that. I always say, choose a proof of concept that I think will not affect, a significant portion of your customer base, right? Or do an internal proof of concept, right? One thing that I actually enjoyed one time, which was a very surprise, was the use of automation RPI for compliance requirements. So they would ping me and say, okay, your training is due on X date. Do you want me to create a calendar invite for you to put it so that you won't forget training? Which I think that was a very, very simple use case, but it actually is very effective use of automation specific to your goals of making sure that you take your training, right? Because that's one of the requirements when you're being evaluated by your managers. Did you complete training on a timely manner? So I think using it in a smaller context, some developing a proof of concept and a use case that actually supports an overall a goal that is important to the organization. I think that would be a good example on how to try it.
Yeah, that use case is so interesting. I mean, the simplicity and that what you're describing is so powerful. What about if you're attacking something more ambitious? I mean, is there any? I mean, what do you do if it's overhaul everything? I mean, how do you approach that?
That's an incredibly difficult question.
Yeah, I'm really
maybe I'll
leaning on
start.
you
So
a
I
lot,
think
huh?
I'm going to go back to the communication aspect for a second, and just maybe it's sort of an educational campaign / communication, right? So if while it may be true, if approaching senior management or any sort of committee with the words overhaul everything, it will not, that sort of will cause, I think, a disproportionate amount of fear, and you're going to have a very significant uphill battle in terms of getting buy-in for something like that. And really, the reason it's not that they don't want to be innovative, it's that the regulatory requirements are often so prescriptive, the fines are so high, the expectations are high, and there's an aspect potentially of customer impact that would then lead to regulatory implications, legal implications, reputational risk. So I think there's more comfort in sort of treading carefully and trying like the simpler, smaller use cases like Pam mentioned. That, the training example I thought was a great one because that applies to like literally everyone in the organization. It's such a simple implementation, relatively speaking, to other types of initiatives, but is incredibly impactful. I think the overhaul everything attitude is great, and if the organization is sort of brave enough to embrace it, it's amazing. But there's so many sort of back-end processes and downstream implications to implementing AI that I think completely reimagining the process is something that would be very difficult to accomplish, at least at this point, and likely taking it in smaller bits and pieces until there's more of a comfort level would probably be more manageable, even albeit less exciting.
Yeah, I would agree to that too, because I mean, if you think about, so the three of us are part of large financial institutions, right? So I don't think to that point they would just do a complete overhaul, especially if something is working, right? And this is where, the proof of concept, maybe sandbox approach is really more of, the things that we would do in-house rather than like a big bang approach.
Yeah, I would add, Pam, what you mentioned. If it is working, I think that's key. I know some banks have gone in for like a overall, just completely changing it and adopting these new techniques, but they had to do it, or maybe they were forced to do it because what they had was not working. So I think that's the only times of when you would go on for this big bang approach.
Excellent. Thank you all. Now, Marina, something you mentioned, I believe, was talent and having the right people inside the organization to be able to effectively use a vendor model or to be able to effectively create your own solutions to problems. And so I'm curious to ask the group, I know there's a fierce, it's very hard to find AI talent right now. And so how do you approach either upskilling employees that you currently have around to be able to understand these different problems and come up with solutions? Or how do you go about, finding people that are able to help you in your efforts? And this is just for anyone in the group.
So, and I'll take that first. So I think that there's a couple of ways to do that actually. So first, if it's more organic to the organization, right? What I would say is find people who are actually interested maybe in stretch projects, right? I know, we're already swamped with our regular work, but really their talent in-house that are interested to actually learn more about these things. I think having the opportunity or giving them an opportunity to do either, part-time work or side gigs, right, where they would experience or allow to take part in this, innovation. I think that's one thing. Second is if you're actually hiring new talent, I think, us, in compliance, it's very subject matter expert, I think, approach, but then you need to train people, right? So if outside it may be, a college grad or maybe for 1 or 2 years experience, and they really want to learn more about compliance, take them in and have that mentor approach, mentor mentee approach, right? Because I think all of us started too without, not being an expert in compliance, right? But as along the way, because it's our interest and that's something that we actually are passionate about or want to learn more about it, we ourselves actually put in the hours and effort, and at the same time reach out to other people so that we will know more about it.
Excellent. Thank you, Pam. Yeah. Amit, Marina, Avi, you want to jump in on talent and upskilling and stuff like that?
Yeah, I would echo what Pam mentioned. I think you'll have to either go for stretch assignments, people who are already in the field but are looking to try something else, get more involved in this new machine learning techniques. That's one aspect. The second aspect is maybe get new talent who are interested in this and who will sort of take the lead and who will find it motivating to work on this aspect within compliance. As Pam mentioned, compliance by itself is not sort of a topic that everybody jumps to at the first instance, but if you combine it with that, fact that we're trying some innovative approaches and you're getting a sort of a, good responsibility is a big sort of area to, delve into, and that may be enticing for some to sort of take that lead.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amit. Let's go ahead and jump to the next topic. Patrika, if you would. All right, so let's talk about the future, which I know everyone in compliance is oftentimes considering. What do you expect for the future of compliance as AI technology expands further? And Marina, I was curious if you would be open to beginning with this question.
Sure, absolutely. I think I would expect that, as I said before, AI use will really continue to proliferate as organizations become more comfortable and they're accustomed to AI-enabled tools, and they start to see the benefits that are derived from their use. I think, as I referred to earlier as well, there's a degree of staff upskilling that we've been talking about that will need to happen as well, be that, to existing staff or bringing on new talent. And I think, I would echo the points made by Amit and Pam. I would also say that, in my view, that type of upskilling should really be born of a very sort of intentional and structured program across the organization, as opposed to having this feeling of like, oh, well, it'll just organically happen. That it might, if you find those types of really assertive, engaged staff members who are excited to learn on their own, who are, open to potentially like side projects in addition to their sort of BAU work. I think that's amazing. I would strongly encourage that. But at the same time, as at like an enterprise level, if there's a view that upskilling is required, and it really, I don't think it would be limited to compliance, right? Typically, compliance staff are really the end users for this AI implementation, but you also need developers, you need data governance folks, you need folks in risk and legal and all these other organizations, all of whom need to effectively be on the same page in terms of what is a digital implementation, what is an AI implementation, where are the risks, how do we mitigate them, things like that. And there needs to be sort of a very well thought out approach, I think, to developing that type of expertise if we're going to succeed on a mass scale. I do see, though, that the use of AI is really, albeit potentially limited at this point, is really further spurring digitalization within compliance processes. And, perhaps so in a more comprehensive manner than we've seen before, I think we'll see a move towards aggregating information from multiple sources to really enable a more holistic review. And I think that type of aggregation would really significantly enhance the compliance officer's ability to efficiently access and apply their judgment and decision-making to complex, multifaceted questions. So for instance, the AI that, that we've discussed so far in the panel, a lot of it seems to be sort of targeted to a very particular use case, like let's use it for transaction monitoring alerts, or let's use it for e-communications review. But something like almost like a dashboard where we can have a more holistic, comprehensive view of risks across the organization, I think would be incredibly helpful to a compliance officer.
Thank you so much, Marina. Yeah, I mean, that sounds amazingly helpful. Do you have an idea how far away we are from that? I mean, I know that's a really specific question, but exactly how futuristic is that view?
From my perspective, at the moment, relatively far. I think, at least from what I've seen, we're still getting comfortable with the more sort of vertical use cases before we can really start to think about applying a more horizontal enterprise-wide approach. But I would be very curious for, others on the panel to jump in as well.
Sure. Amit, Pam, would you like to jump in here?
I think I would agree. There are more vertical use cases right now. But one of the points that Marina mentioned about aggregation of data, I know there has been sort of some news about financial firms getting together to share their data especially with AML and transaction monitoring, and I think that happens. That'll give a big boost to what we're speaking about here, because as Pam mentioned earlier, data is a challenge. If we can get the financial institutions to start sharing, what are the suspicious activities that they're monitoring, what they're identifying, have a common sort of platform where this is shared, that data can be then used. And I think if that happens, that'll be very promising and give a big boost to all of the techniques that we're speaking about.
So I can add to that. I mean, we talked about, regulatory acceptance, I think would be first and foremost, right? There is a multi-agency RFI actually out there requesting comments around financial institutions' use of AI, including machine learning. So I guess that what that signals is that the regulators know or is aware of the potential use of AI and getting feedback, right, from FIs on how do they see this coming along. So I think that's really good. I think, better data, we talked about that. And actually the topic now that I hear about AI is really more around bias, right? So once we have all of this data, now you have these techniques, applying them, how do you make sure that the result is not biased, right? That's one of the things. And I think as businesses are creating more tailored products, there's going to be more nuances in regulations and applications. To Marina's point about having a dashboard, I think that will be good, right? And then having that understanding the end-to-end life cycle of a business And then from there, actually, my vision would be what are the control points? And at the same time, what are the regulatory expectations around those controls, right? So if you think about, so it's really what it means is building a partnership and building a cohesive enterprise risk management framework. Marina mentioned partnering with your risk counterparts, legal, technology, because when you talk about AI, I think it's really a collaboration between the business, legal, compliance, technology to be able to use these techniques and understand, how you can make use of this technology to make better decisions, right? And the last thing is, I think uh, the world will become much more complex as it is, right? There's going to be a lot of data, but then there's going to be a lot of regulations. It's going to be global in nature. And now you talk about open source architecture too. What kind of complexity or additional information that will bring in. So a lot of things to be looking forward to, and a lot of things that compliance needs to keep abreast on with all of these things.
Wow, you paint a complicated picture, Pam, for all of us. I think that's
this
really
is my life.
yeah. I mean,
Well, maybe if I could just add to that, I think Pam made an excellent point from the global perspective. I think compliance officers, perhaps in the past were really supposed to be well versed in particular. Let's say they support a particular business line, so you need to be well versed in, how that business line functions, what the regulations are that are applicable to it, to make sure that you help them stay compliant and are able to address their questions. When you're taking on a global AI implementation, you also now need to be thinking about data privacy rules and cybersecurity aspects, and that requires upskilling to an extent as well, like really making sure that you're investing in staying up to date on the industry discussions, on the regulations that are coming out in this space. Because, for instance, we're all based on the East Coast in the United States. We're supporting American financial institutions, but those institutions often have branches and locations that are located elsewhere where they're going to be subject to the rules of of that locality. And so to some extent in our implementations, even in the US, we need to be thinking about, let's say, European rules like GDPR and things like that. And I think that's also it's making the assessment more complex. It's increasing the risk, but at the same time, from a compliance officer perspective, I think it also makes the job a lot more interesting.
yeah. Thank you all for your responses. I am curious. I mean, how much time is spent in your work thinking about how regulations may change, in the future? My guess is a lot. If you are, and so the question really maybe is, with all that time spent thinking about how they will change, I mean, is there any value to having them change and then really knowing, what they are, rather than being in sort of a murky situation of uncertainty? I mean, there's so much in the news about all the change we expect. And I do wonder if maybe you're looking forward to a time when, okay, here it is, it's set. I mean, I guess, how would you respond to that for anyone?
I mean,
I can take that question on too. I can start, or Marina, if you want to start, you can.
no, please go ahead.
So I think that regulations or they don't, laws and regulations that don't change that often, right? But the challenge is that there are new products and services or technology which you would see now in the digital asset space, right? That because the regulations are so old or was applicable in the 1950s or a long time ago, how do you apply that to the current products and technology and innovation that's happening today? So that's really, I think that's more of the work that we're trying to do, is interpret that and then see how it can be applied. So that's it. And then from a, we have this from a compliance standpoint, and this is where we actually think that the use of AI is that regulatory change management, right? If we have the tool to actually see what's changing, and Marina again had mentioned that, where it will be good if you highlight the change. If there's a specific line item, then it'll be easier for us to actually do that and then perform the next steps of having the impact analysis.
Yeah, I was going to mention that there is a spectrum. I mean, you don't want the rules to change quite often, like every quarter or every 6 months, because that'll place a more heavy burden. But also, as Pam mentioned, some of the rules are so, back to when the digital transformation was not there, when we didn't have cryptocurrencies, we didn't have Bitcoins and all of these digital payment forms. They have not changed. So I think it becomes a question of then how do you interpret the rules that were written back in the 1930s and interpret it to what applies and what is relevant for this one. So in some cases, they have not moved, quite as fast as you would expect.
Yeah, I
Excellent.
would
Yeah,
agree
thank
with.
you so much. Go ahead, Marina. Sorry.
I would echo those points. I think we've heard these types of aspects raised in industry discussions over the last few years, as new regulations are out for comment and there's RFIs published and things like that. And I think the regulators are also realizing that taking a very prescriptive approach may not always be the best case, especially in the case of technology that's evolving so rapidly that, when there are regulations that are based on a specific type of technology, that type of technology may no longer really be prevalent or in use or the best possible technology to use for that type of purpose 5-10 years down the line. And that's a conservative estimate. And I think that it's really important for new rules and regulations to be technology agnostic, which is something that regulators are increasingly recognizing as well, and flexible enough that they can sort of survive the test of time and not pose issues, shortly after being implemented because the technology has outpaced the regulatory language.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for your perspectives. Well, this panel, we are about out of time. This panel has been really informative. I've loved talking to each of you. And thank you so, so much for joining. For all the attendees out there, we're happy to have you as well. You are AI4 VIPs. Patrika, I'll kick it over to you without any further ado.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dan. To all of our panelists, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. I know I've learned a lot, and I know this virtual audience is giving you a huge virtual round of applause. Woo! And a special thank you to Dan for moderating and keeping us on track. That was awesome. Thank you again. And for the audience, thank you so much for joining us today for this awesome content. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and we look forward to seeing you at future AI4 events. Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.